Hello and welcome to the Theosophical Society in America National Capital Lodge public meeting. And before we begin, I'm going to just ask us all to take a moment of silence, and I'll read the invocation, and then I will introduce our guest today. So as you're all muted, I will read the invocation by Annie Besant. O hidden light, vibrant in every atom, O hidden light, shining in every creature, O hidden love, embracing all in oneness, may all who feel themselves as one with thee know they are therefore one with every other. And thank you. Okay, so today we have a presentation on Gurdijeff, and which I'm really looking forward to. And let me introduce our guest is Jeff Tripodi. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correct, but I'll find out in a moment. He's been interested in religion and spirituality since he was a child, attending these very mysterious events called Catholic masses. They were in those days being conducted in Latin. He was introduced to theosophy in the early 1970s and to the teachings of Gurdijeff in the early 1980s. In the late 1990s and for the next 15 years, he studied Kriya Yoga with Goswami Kriyananda at the Temple of Kriya Yoga in Chicago. He's received a smattering of other inspirational ideas from various religions, philosophies, and mystics along the way. But Kriya Yoga, Gurdijeff, and Theosophy provide the foundation of his spiritual study and practice. Nature is a great inspiration and teacher to him as well. So welcome, Jeff, and thank you for being here. And go ahead and unmute, and I'll let you go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Desiree. Do I need to share the screen again?
Whenever you're ready, yeah. There you go,
Yeah.
looks good.
Okay, very good. It's very nice to be here with all of you. Today I'll focus on the practical teachings of Gurdijeff, teachings that each of us can apply to our daily inner work. Let me start with a quote. Gurdijeff says, "Religion is doing. A man does not merely think his religion or feel it. He lives his religion as much as he is able. Otherwise, it's not religion, but fantasy or philosophy." So a little less today about the philosophy and theories of Gurdijeff and a little more about the practices. I'll start with a brief biography of Gurdijeff. Then I'll go over his ideas about the inner world or landscape of a typical human being, his psychological ideas. I'll follow that with a discussion of the practices themselves, grouped into three major areas: conservation of energy, strivings or efforts we should make on a daily basis, and then other or miscellaneous practices, nonetheless very important. Finally, I'll recommend some books for further study if you're interested in learning more about Gurdijeff. The exact date of Gurdjieff's birth isn't certain. It's thought to be somewhere between 1866 and 1877. He was born in Armenia, which was then part of the Russian Empire. Gurdjieff's father was Greek and his mother was Armenian. Gurdjieff's childhood was spent in Kars, a city that's now in northeast Turkey, not far from his birthplace. Back then, it was also part of the Russian Empire. It was an area of great ethnic diversity, exposing the young Gurdjieff to many cultures and languages. This area, known as the Caucasus, which is the starred area on the map, was also a crossroads between the ancient traditions of the East and the modern scientific culture of the West. Gurdjieff seems to have been very much influenced by his father, who was a carpenter by trade. He was also an ashok or bard. So Gurdjieff heard his father recite many legends and stories, including the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Arabian Nights. During his childhood, Gurdjieff showed a great interest in science and religion. Eventually, he came to feel that neither of them was providing him with meaningful answers as to the nature and purpose of his existence. This dissatisfaction eventually led him to search further afield for answers. The next part of Gurdjieff's life is full of travels to many different places with a group of like-minded individuals he called the Seekers of Truth. He was in search of a deeper teaching that he had come to feel might still exist somewhere. These travels probably took place in the 1880s, 1890s, and the first decade of the 1900s. He was led to such places as Central Asia, Egypt, the Levant, Ethiopia, India, Tibet, Greece, Italy, and Iran, all the starred areas on this map. The photo of him here was supposedly taken in the early 1900s in Kashgar, a town on the Silk Road in Western China. Gurdjieff was never forthcoming about the source or sources of his teachings. Some commentators have noted Sufi influences in a number of his ideas and practices. Some have noted Orthodox Christian influences. Others have mentioned Gnosticism and Hermeticism. He once referred to his teachings as esoteric Christianity, but he said this Christianity had existed for thousands of years before Christ, going back to prehistoric Egypt. He referred to this time period in Egypt as pre-Sans Egypt, the Egypt that existed before the coming of the desert. He also referred to his teachings on occasion as Haida Yoga, Haida meaning quick in the sense that he was trying to work on the head, the heart, and the body simultaneously. He's quoted as saying, "Take the understanding of the East and the knowledge of the West, and then seek." Gurdjieff, pictured on the left, resurfaced in Moscow in 1912, and for the next several years assembled and taught groups of students, including his most famous student, P.D. Uspensky, who's pictured on the right. Because of the uncertainties and chaos that existed in Russia at this time with World War I and the overthrow of the Tsar, Gurdjieff's group had to move several times. Eventually, Gurdjieff ended up in France, just south of Paris, and established a school there called the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. The main building is pictured here and was known as the Prieuré. Uspensky broke from Gurdjieff during this time and ended up teaching the system, as he understood it, in England. It's at the Prieuré where Gurdjieff became more well-known in the West. A number of well-known writers, artists, and professionals lived and studied at the school and wrote about their experiences there. The work at the Prieuré was a combination of lectures, music, dance, exercises, and physical and manual labor. As I mentioned earlier, Gurdjieff wanted to develop the head, the heart, and the body in unison. This, he felt, would result in the harmonious development of the human being, as opposed to a one-sided development. As an aside, the Theosophists Maud Hoffman and A. Trevor Barker were pupils of Gurdjieff at the Prieuré while they were working on the Mahatma letters. In 1924, Gurdjieff began visiting the United States. His pupil, A.R. Araj, was tasked with lecturing to groups in New York City and with raising funds. Also in 1924, Gurdjieff had a very serious car accident in which he nearly died. He spent some time convalescing, and during this period cut back on the school in France, keeping on only those who he considered to be his most dedicated pupils. At this time, Gurdjieff began shifting much of his effort to writing. This was to lead over the course of many years to 3 books for which he is most well known and which I'll discuss later. Despite lectures and fundraising success in the United States, which included the efforts of his student Gene Toomer in Chicago, the school at the Prieuré ran into debt and was shut down in 1932. He established a new group in Paris called The Rope, which consisted only of women, mainly writers. Although the group disbanded in 1937, there is a rich collection of writings available describing their time with Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff lived in Paris for the rest of his life, including during the Nazi occupation in World War II. He continued teaching small groups in his apartment there until his death in 1949. After his death, all of his major writings were published, and his teachings were carried on by various groups, notably the groups founded by his student Jean de Salzman. The middle picture in this slide is of Gurdjieff's strange gravesite with 2 pylons facing each other. Gene de Saltzman is pictured to the right. So let me move on now to some of what Gurdijeff has to say about the inner world or inner state of most human beings. I'll start with this quote. Man is a machine. Everything with him happens. He cannot stop the flow of his thoughts. He cannot control his imagination, his emotions, his attention. He lives in a subjective world of I love, I do not love, I like, I do not like, I want, I do not want. That is, of what he thinks he likes, of what he thinks he does not like, of what he thinks he wants, of what he thinks he does not want. He does not see the real world. The real world is hidden from him by the wall of imagination. He lives asleep. He is asleep. Gurdjieff describes 4 states of presence in a human being, each state differing from the others by its relative degree of consciousness. First is the state of sleep. The second state is the waking state. Gurdjieff says that for most human beings, this is largely a state of hypnotic sleep, the subjective world described in the quote I just showed. The third state occurs when an individual is conscious of one's own being, apart from what he or she is experiencing. Gurdjieff calls this state self-consciousness. It's a state when I begin to see myself as I am, and I become objective towards myself. The fourth state of presence occurs when an individual perceives the external world as it is, not as it's filtered through one's senses and subjective states of consciousness. This state is called objective consciousness. I may read about such states in the lives of great saints and sages, couched in terms such as enlightenment. To reach this state in a lasting way, I have to undergo a process of inner transformation. To be fully developed as a human being, Gurdjieff says that I should be capable of being present in both the third and the fourth states of consciousness. Another quote from Gurdjieff, if we take an average cultured man, and he always means man and woman here, he has a patriarchal way of saying things, but he's referring to both sexes, obviously. We shall see that in the vast majority of cases, his personality is the active element in him, while his essence is the passive element. The inner growth of a man cannot begin so long as this order of things remains unchanged. Personality must become passive and essence must become active. Gene de Saltzman puts it a different way when she says, the ego is a good servant, but a bad master. According to Gurdjieff, I'm divided into 2 parts, which he calls essence and personality. Essence is what I'm born with. It includes my innate capacities as well as my weaknesses. I may be born with a gift for mathematics, music, gymnastics, or painting, as the top pictures of these young people show. It's potential, and it develops to some degree after birth. It's what Gurdjieff calls my being, the core of my individuality, the part of me which can grow spiritually. Its experience of the world is real in the sense that it's the innate part of me that's the one experiencing. Among some followers of Gurdjieff's teachings, you'll see it referred to as a soul in embryo. Personality is what I acquire. It's non-existent at birth, but gradually, sometimes traumatically, forms a layer around essence as I'm exposed to the influences of family, friends, and society in general. Much of it's acquired through education. Much of it's acquired through imitation. It doesn't belong to me. It's not an innate part of me. In comparison to essence, it's not real and may even be largely imaginary. One's views, opinions, words, habitual postures, and movements form through personality. In a sense, personality represents all of the programming I've received and how I've adapted to it. In the bottom row of images, I've tried to express the idea of personality as expressed in political debate, patriotism, formal education, and religious convictions. You go back here a second. As a young child, I largely experienced the world through essence. I behave and express myself as I really am. My desires, tastes, likes, and dislikes express my being such as it is. But as I grow older and begin to face the world, my personality forms and my essence begins to recede into the background. Both essence and personality are needed in life, but I need to be able to distinguish between what is essence in me and what is personality. Trying to sort all of this out is part of the work that Gurdijeff tells me that I need to do. In the end, personality should serve essence to enable essence to develop. Personality may develop in knowledge, but it's only essence that can develop in being. So a quote from Jean de Saltzman: there are three forces of the mind, body, and feeling. Unless these three are together, equally developed and harmonized, a steady connection cannot be made with a higher force. Everything in the work is a preparation for that connection. That is the aim of the work. A human being has 7 centers, according to Gurdijeff. Each of these centers falls into one of 3 levels, like a 3-story building. In fact, Gurdijeff describes us as 3-brained beings. The lower level is the physical story or brain, the middle one, the emotional story or brain, and the upper level is the intellectual story or brain. There are 5 lower centers and 2 higher centers. The centers of the lower story are the instinctive center, the moving center, and the sex center. They're maintained by the physical food we eat. The middle story consists of the emotional center, which is responsible for our lower emotions and perceptions. It's maintained by the air we breathe. The higher emotional center is related to the state of being present to oneself, the state of self-consciousness that I spoke about earlier. It's a center of a higher order from which we're generally disconnected. The upper story consists of the intellectual center, which is responsible for ideation and thought. Food for the intellectual center is the impressions that we take in. The higher intellectual center is related to the state of objective consciousness that I spoke about earlier, a state of universal being and presence. Like the higher emotional center, it's a center of a higher order from which we're generally disconnected. As noted in the diagram in this slide, in Gurdjieff's teachings, an undeveloped human being is being controlled by life. He or she is essentially a physical body with undeveloped emotional, mental, and spiritual potential. In contrast, a fully developed human being has created more subtle bodies within himself or herself that can fully express his or her emotional, mental, and spiritual potential. Gurdjieff calls these bodies subtle or higher being bodies. These bodies are called the natural, spiritual, and divine bodies in esoteric Christianity. In Indian and theosophical thought, they're called the astral, mental, and causal bodies. As these higher being bodies become fully developed, control begins to emanate from them, and access to the higher emotional and higher intellectual centers becomes sustained. Such a person is ultimately obeying the will of a higher order rather than being controlled by life itself. Development of these more subtle bodies is the ultimate goal of the work. Another quote from Gurdjieff: man has no permanent and unchangeable I. Every thought, every mood, every desire, every sensation says I. And in each case, it seems to be taken for granted that this I belongs to the whole man, and that a thought, a desire, or an aversion is expressed by this whole. In actual fact, there is no foundation whatsoever for this assumption. So I'd like to take a closer look at this idea. One of the illusions I live under is that I have one eye. Gurdjieff teaches that I have many eyes, any one of which may take charge as the eye of the moment. He says that I don't see this aspect of myself, or I'm only vaguely aware of it. One eye gives way to a different eye depending on external circumstances or the coming into my awareness of certain memories. I keep identifying with each of these little eyes as they change from one to the next. Much of the practice connected to Gurdjieff's teachings is to establish an inner separation from this mechanical succession of eyes that operate within me. As I become more able to observe this mechanical process, I become aware of eyes that are useful to me in my inner work and eyes that hinder my efforts. The process of establishing order and unity among these many eyes can be described using the metaphor of an ancient household with its servants and masters. Stage one is the formation of an observing eye among the many other eyes. Observing eye is like pointing a video camera at your internal world and recording what goes on. It's an eye that simply observes all the other little eyes that are operating through the lower centers. Stage two is called deputy steward. Deputy steward is able to do more than observe. Deputy steward begins to sort the many eyes into what is useful for inner work and what is detrimental to it. It tries to encourage the useful, beneficial eyes and discourage or prevent the harmful ones from manifesting. In other words, deputy steward is trying to get the household in order. Stage three is called the steward. The steward represents a level of greater control over the many eyes. It's able to put and keep the internal household in order. It makes the house ready for stage four, which is the appearance of the master or real eye, and it recedes when the master appears. Related to this process of self-observation is a practice called self-remembering. Here are some quotes on self-remembering. Remember yourself always and everywhere, Gurdijeff. Only by remembering himself does a man truly begin to awaken, Gurdijeff again. All your work upon yourself is connected with self-remembering, Uspensky. When one begins to see that one can only begin to remember oneself for seconds at a time, it seems negligible. But what one must understand is that it's difficult because it's the beginning of a new state for us, the key to a new world. Rodney Collin, who was a student of Uspensky. So let me talk a little bit more about the practices of self-observation and self-remembering. Self-observation, or the observing eye, is an effort to divide my attention in two directions, towards the external world in the way I typically do, and towards the functions of my lower centers, which form my inner and physical states. Instead of my attention being totally directed outwards, part of it's held back in order to observe myself. Self-remembering is a step beyond self-observation. It's the beginning of the third state of consciousness, mentioned earlier. Rodney Collin, a student of Uspensky, says that it's attention divided into three: the inner, the outer, and something higher that is aware of the scene in which my experience is unfolding. Sri Madhavashish, an English Indian mystic, calls self-remembering the awareness of being aware. Awareness in this context is not the same as thought, emotion, or sensation. Gurdjieff is quoted as saying that self-remembering is simply being angry and knowing at the same time that you are angry. In all of these definitions of self-remembering, the common theme is an inner separation between me as the experiencer and the experience itself. Both self-observation, where my attention is divided in two, and self-remembering, where my attention is divided in three, are fundamental practices of these teachings. So I'm transitioning into more specific practices at this point. In order to do the work of self-observation and self-remembering, energy is needed. Many of the practices Gurdjieff asked me to follow help me to conserve that energy. So let's take a look at some energy leaks, areas where I lose energy, and what I need to do to conserve that energy. Unnecessary talking. Sometimes I speak unconsciously without really thinking about what I'm saying or why I'm saying it. I may even be uncomfortable with silence, especially if I'm only with one person. Gurdjieff says this wastes energy. I'm asked to be a little more thoughtful about my speech. I'm asked to try to quiet my mind as well. so that there isn't a lot of unnecessary inner talking going on. Negative imagination and daydreaming or fantasizing. Creative, purposeful imagination is considered a useful activity, but negative imagination and daydreaming are energy leaks. If I'm a worrywart, imagining the worst possible outcome from a situation, I'm expending a lot of energy in a very useless way. Daydreaming and fantasizing may be more pleasant than negative imagination, but again, it's using a great deal of psychic energy and it's taking me away from awareness of the present moment. I'm asked to work on eliminating these habits. Lying, wiseacring, and self-justifying. In Gurdieff's teachings, lying includes what we normally think of as lying, but it has more to do with the lies I tell myself. In this sense, it occurs in different ways. One way is through what Gurdijeff calls wiseacring. This is speaking about things as if I really understand what I'm talking about from my own experience. In this slide, it's the picture of the man with the huge head talking to a group of tiny people. It uses energy in the sense that I'm trying to maintain a false image of myself, propping up this false image with expressions of all that I claim to know. When I look at things more objectively, I have to admit to myself that there's very little that I do know from my own experience. Another aspect of lying that uses energy is self-justification. Here's an example of this type of lying from Cy Ginsberg's book, Gurdjieff Unveiled. Cy writes, I meet a friend. She says something one of my little eyes considers to be offensive, and I'm hurt. When one of my eyes is hurt, it sulks and thinks evil of my friend. This wastes energy, but I think I'm right in feeling this way. So in looking at this short anecdote from Cy's book, this thinking that I'm right and feeling negative towards my friend is self-justification. It generates a lot of inner talk using a great deal of my energy, and it takes me away from awareness of myself in the present moment. Identification. If I'm not in a state of self-remembering, I'm in a state of identification, either with my internal thoughts and emotions or with an external activity or event. To the extent I'm identified, I'm using energy that could be utilized towards maintaining a state of presence. Identification is a process that occurs in stages. The most subtle form of identification, and the one most difficult for me to observe, is identification with my own personality. Let me read Gurdjieff's quote on this slide. He who works becomes an actor, a real actor in life. To be an actor is to play a role. Life is a theater where every man plays a role. Every day they change it. Today one role, tomorrow another role. He only is a good actor who is able to remember himself and consciously play his role, no matter what it may be. So I place political and religious symbols on this slide because these are areas where many of us tend to get heavily identified. Internal or inner considering. Internal or inner considering is a state in which I'm concerned about the impression I'm making on other people. It can develop into a feeling of being offended by what I perceive to be a lack of consideration, respect, admiration, or love from others that I feel I deserve. I may begin to imagine all sorts of things about what other people think of me that may not be the way they're thinking at all. This inner state can consume an enormous amount of my energy, completely taking me out of the state of self-awareness. The antidote to internal considering is called external considering, a practice which I'll discuss in more detail under the strivings. Negative emotion. The last energy conservation practice I'll discuss is negative emotion. A lot of energy is lost when I'm in this state, such as anger, irritation, fear, anxiety, or depression. Gurdjieff tells me not to express negative emotions, but I'm also advised not to suppress them, which also causes a lot of energy. Rather, I'm told not to identify with them, instead to observe them, get some degree of separation from them. Again, the goal of all these practices for conservation of energy is to help provide me with the energy I need to maintain a state of self-remembering. So now I'll move into the practices that are known as the strivings. And the strivings are inner efforts that I make every day. The first one is to strive to have everything satisfying and really necessary for our planetary body. So I need to honor and care for my physical body. This is the body that's been given to me as a vehicle for experience. Without it, I can't evolve. It can be seen as the duty of a responsible tenant towards the house rented from a landlord. Do I care for my body, feed it properly, give it rest when it needs it, give it exercise when it needs it, give it fresh air? How consciously do I perform these activities? For example, am I in a rush to eat my meals? This is also work related to the instinctive and moving centers. The next striving is to strive constantly for self-perfection and the sense of being. Here, Gurdijeff is not talking about the acquisition of new knowledge or new skills to be used for worldly purposes. Certainly, I can and should acquire new knowledge and new skills, but not for the purpose of exalting my ego or personality. Rather, he's talking about the growth of my essence. For example, to push myself to do something that my body doesn't want to do, overcoming its resistance and perhaps the emotional resentment that arises within me as a result of this tension. Acquiring patience, humility, consideration of others, what we might call the virtues. This is work related to the emotional center. The next striving is to strive to know ever more concerning the laws of world creation and world maintenance. In this striving, I'm asked to study cosmology. In its broadest sense, this striving includes the study of science, religion, philosophy, and mythology, the study of the secret doctrine, for example. In a narrower sense, it includes the study of Gurdjieff's cosmology, which would require a whole other presentation. In Gurdjieff's cosmology, there are two primary laws governing the creation and maintenance of the universe. They're called the law of three and the law of seven. I should study and reflect upon all these cosmological ideas so that I might better understand the place and purpose of my existence. This is work related to the intellectual center. The next striving is the striving from the beginning of my existence to pay for my arising and my individuality as quickly as possible, in order afterwards to be free to lighten as much as possible the sorrow of our common Creator. There are different levels of meaning to this striving. In a more mundane sense, I have obligations to give back to the environment for sustaining my physical body, to my parents for creating my physical body and caring for me until I could care for myself, to my wife, husband, or partner for their support and sacrifices, and to all human beings, past and present, who through their actions and labors have helped me directly or indirectly. Do I find ways to express my gratitude and to give back in order to pay for the help I've been given? On a deeper level, it refers to my obligations as a created being with a specific purpose to make the effort to fulfill that purpose, to evolve to the full potential of a human being. The next striving is to strive to assist the most rapid perfecting of other beings, both those similar to ourselves and those of other forms, up to the degree of self-individuality. Similar to theosophy and Gurdjieff's teachings, everything that exists is connected. Love is the connection. Gurdjieff writes the following: in nature, everything is connected and everything is alive. Wherever there is life, there is love. Each life is a representative of God. Whoever can see the representative will see him who is represented. Every life is sensitive to love. It's very important for a man who works on himself to understand that change can take place in him only if he changes his attitude to the outside world. For God, there is no difference between the life of men and the life of beings of any other form. Man is life, and the beings of other exterior forms are life. The essence of all beings are to him equally valuable and dear. Another quote from Gurdjieff: practice love on animals first. They react better and more sensitively. The next striving is to strive to watch the reflection of the splendor of the sunrise every day in the state of self-consciousness. I'm asked to take a moment to become aware of myself as an existence apart from my thoughts, sensations, and emotions, and in that state to observe the sunrise. I may feel a sense of scale when I observe such an event, and perhaps I feel my place within this scale. I may feel a sense of unity with the experience. I may be humbled by it or experience a feeling of beauty, or as Gurdijeff says, splendor. In addition to the sunrise, I think this practice can be extended to other natural settings and events. The next striving is to strive to meditate each day. Gurdijeff is asking me to try to spend some time each day in a formal meditative state. An excellent source, if you are looking for specific exercises he recommended, is Gurdijeff, Mysticism, Contemplation, and Exercises by Joseph Aziz. One aspect that's predominant in many of these exercises is the practice of bodily sensing, and I'll discuss that in more detail in a bit. To strive to consciously labor. In all my activities, no matter how simple or complex, I must always strive to act or labor consciously. This is a fundamental practice of the work. One might call it mindfulness in the sense that I'm asked to pay close attention to whatever it is I'm doing, but it also includes attention to my inner state as I perform these activities. In becoming aware of my inner state, I'm watching the body, the emotions, and the intellect, the three brains that comprise my lower self. It's a movement towards self-consciousness, the third state of consciousness mentioned earlier. Next striving is to strive to intentionally suffer. Gurdijeff explains this by giving as an example the greatest intentional suffering. This is to compel myself to be able to endure what he calls the displeasing manifestations of others towards us. He also simplified this striving with the aphorism that I must like what it does not like, it referring to the personality. Gurdijeff makes a distinction between unnecessary suffering and intentional suffering. An example of unnecessary suffering is feeling offended at something someone says to me, something that I feel is insulting to me. I may spend a great deal of energy and time stewing over this perceived insult. If instead I choose to endure this action from another person and consciously observe or witness the suffering it may cause me, then I'm practicing intentional suffering. This practice potentially has great value as it keeps me in the present moment as an observer of my experience, and it can result in the transformation or transmutation of negative emotion, creating a substance that can be used for the growth of the higher being bodies within my physical body. Next of the strivings is to strive to put ourselves in the position of other beings, both those similar to ourselves and those of other forms. I spoke earlier about inner considering, a state in which I'm concerned about the impression I'm making on other people. A state that also includes a feeling of not being respected or admired or treated fairly by others. It can often be based on imagination. The antidote to this tendency is the practice of external considering. External considering can be thought of as self-remembering in relation to other people. External considering is putting myself in another person's shoes, trying to see things from another person's point of view, trying to see my relationship to other people from their point of view. It's doing not what is pleasing to me, but what is useful to them. Sometimes it's described as not walking over people without seeing them. Gurdijeff says the chief means of happiness in this life is to consider externally always, internally never. Another quote from him, only he can be impartial who is able to put himself into the position of others. Some results of external considering are that I gradually stop becoming the center of my universe. My universe opens up as I become more aware of the needs and struggles of other human beings who in their own way are also trying to evolve. I become more aware of the results of my actions on others. Also, I begin to move away from my mechanical reaction of who is right and who is wrong. Just a few more strivings. To strive to constantly sense and be cognizant of the inevitability of our own death, as well as the death of everyone upon whom our eyes or attention rests. Gurdijeff is trying to wake me up from what he calls my hypnotic sleep, the world of personal ego in which I live and which causes me to be disconnected from what is real. He's asking me to be aware of the passing of time in each moment and that my time here is limited, as it is for everyone. He's trying to cure me of what he calls the disease of tomorrow, in which I keep putting off the inner work I need to do because I have the illusion that my life and the life of others will continue indefinitely. He wants me to feel a greater sense of urgency in making spiritual efforts by realizing and acting upon the notion that my life can end at any moment. A quote by him in this regard: one of the strongest motives for the wish to work on yourself is the realization that you may die at any moment. Only you must first realize this. Through this practice, I see also the preciousness of all lives because I sense the transiency of those lives. Like the practice of observing the sunrise, this practice can help to alter my relationship to the world by giving me a sense of scale, this time in the temporal realm. It helps to take me out of my ego awareness and put my awareness in the present moment. It also puts me more in contact with the reality of death, which is a part of life that culturally and instinctively I may have some fear in acknowledging it. The last of his strivings is to strive to manifest as if we already stand in objective consciousness. This striving seems to be a practice of creative visualization. Cy Ginsberg says in Gurdijeff Unveiled that Gurdijeff considered this a useful form of self-deception. In other traditions, it's seen as constructive imagination. This practice may be similar in concept to what is called deity yoga in Buddhism, in which one identifies with a particular deity through visualization and ritual. In my own practice, for example, I look at the statue of a seated Buddha that's in front of me, and then close my eyes and try to experience the transcendence and serenity that I perceive in that image. So now I'm going to go to a final set of practices, which I've categorized as other or miscellaneous, and they're nonetheless very important practices within these teachings. Gurdijeff used what are called stop exercises with his students. Often these stop exercises, he used these stop exercises when they were performing the movements or dances that he had devised. And I'll talk about the movements in the next slide. When issued this command to stop, which would come unexpectedly, each student would freeze and then take that moment to observe himself or herself more closely, his or her mental, emotional, and physical states. The value of the stop exercises is that a collection of these snapshots over time can serve to give the student a greater understanding that might not be as easily formed through the practice of self-observation. Ideally, the stop command is done by a teacher in a seemingly random and unexpected way. Without a teacher, it can be done in other ways, such as with a timer on a watch or a computer. Any moment that we pause to observe ourselves is helpful, but the effect of this exercise is more potent if it's the result of an unexpected trigger. According to Gurdijeff, the movements he devised for his students were based on dances he had observed in folk settings, as well as in various monasteries during his travels. One intention of these movements or dances is to develop attention and to work towards a three-centered experience in which the mind, the heart, and the body are aligned and working together. Gurdijeff can't be called a composer in the sense of a Bach or a Beethoven, but he collaborated with a classical composer named Thomas de Hartmann, who was one of his students, to produce a number of works for piano. Gurdijeff had an interest in the effect of vibrations and tones on the human psyche. So his music often accompanied his movements and was intended to evoke a particular kind of inner response. Much of the formal mindfulness practice in Gurdjieff's teachings is centered on the body. Gurdjieff saw the body as more stable than the mind or the emotions, an easier anchor on which to focus one's attention. Thus, there are a variety of so-called sensing exercises that have come to be included in the practice. When I'm performing sensing exercises, I'm trying to focus my attention on impressions such as touch, pressure, heat, cold, position, and balance. I typically include in this practice the direction of my breath to the areas of body and sensation that I wish to explore. It's very easy for my mind to want to take over this process, so I'm especially trying to experience sensation through the language of sensation and not through the thought of a sensation. Another thing I'm trying to do is attain a deep relaxation of my body, eliminating physical tension, which takes away energy from inner work. Finally, I'm trying to achieve a kind of global awareness of body, breath, and attention, a harmonious three-centered experience. So one thing I'm going to do is send Suzanne an email with a video link to some of the movements and music, as well as a better description of the sensing exercises, some more basic ones in case you're interested in them. But what I wanted to conclude with in just the next couple of minutes is some recommended reading if you have an interest in pursuing these studies about Gurdjieff. I think a good place to start, in my opinion at least, is In Search of the Miraculous by Ouspensky. It provides an introduction to many of Gurdjieff's ideas, and it's an interesting story as well of the early years when Gurdjieff was teaching in Russia. Two introductory books I also recommend are Toward Awakening by Jean Vess and Gurdjieff Unveiled by Cy Ginsberg. And I've got an electronic copy of Cy's book, so I'll send that to Suzanne as well in the email. Maurice Nicole's Psychological Commentaries is a 5-volume work. It's an in-depth commentary on many of Gurdjieff's ideas. Nicole was a student of both Ouspensky and Gurdjieff. He was also a psychologist who had worked with Carl Jung. So he brings a psychological slant to the teachings that is very helpful. Jean de Saltzman's The Reality of Being is a step-by-step explanation of how to move towards a more integrated state of being. I think it's a beautifully written book. Every sentence is one worth pondering. And whether you're interested in Gurdjieff or not, it's just a fine book to read. Madame de Saltzman was also instrumental in getting a movie produced about the early life of Gurdjieff, based on his book, Meetings with Remarkable Men. I mentioned Gurdjieff, Mysticism, Contemplation, and Exercises by Joseph Aziz. It's a very scholarly work, and it describes in detail many of these sensing exercises and contemplation exercises that Gurdjieff provided to his students, especially towards the end of his life. Boyhood with Gurdjieff by Fritz Peters is just a biographical book about Gurdjieff. Fritz Peters lived at the Prieuré while he was a young boy, and they developed a relationship, and it's just a fun and interesting book, and you get a lot of insight into Gurdjieff as a teacher and as a human being. Gurdjieff's writings themselves are very difficult, and I wouldn't recommend them to anybody who's not familiar with the basic ideas until you become familiar with the basic ideas. Beelzebub's Tales is kind of the masterwork. It's often read in a group setting, just like The Secret Doctrine. It's very complicated. Meetings with Remarkable Men and Life is Real Only Then When I Am are the other two books in this trilogy that he wrote, and they're meant to be read in that order. There are transcripts of his early talks, which have been compiled into a book called Views from the Real World, and transcripts of talks in Paris during World War II that are the wartime meetings. I'm going to end with this quote from Jean de Saltzman. I think it really encapsulates the spirit of Gurdjieff's teachings. I'm here alive, and around me exists the entire universe. The life that is around me is in me. I feel this universal life, the force of the universe, and I feel myself existing as part of the world that surrounds me. Here, everything helps, even the cushion on which I sit. I am present, awakened to what I am, and I see that the most important thing is to be. I know it now, and as I know it, I feel related to everything around me. There's no before, no after, only life itself. I have the impression of emerging from a dream. Everything is real. I feel free and at peace. In this state, I do not seek, I do not wish, I do not expect anything. There's only what I am in this moment. And that's from her book, The Reality of Being.
That was
So that's it.
wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeff. That was really a lovely presentation, and I think a really good introduction for someone like me who doesn't know that much about Gurdjieff. I'd like to go ahead and start with JD put a couple questions in the chat while you were speaking. So JD, if you don't mind, go ahead and ask him your questions, and then we'll move on to whoever had their hand raised.
All right. My questions are actually I have three of them. Is the enneagram a good model for the personalities or the eyes? The first question. Second question, what were Gurdjieff's struggles, strivings, sufferings later in his life? And then the third question was, do you see that movie of the Meeting with Remarkable Men was a realistic documentary?
Oh, well, I'll start with the last question first. There is debate on how allegorical the book is, Meetings with Remarkable Men. So I do think it is biographical, but only up to a point. And I think a great deal of the book and the movie itself is allegorical. And that's the best way I can answer that question. The second question as to what struggles he had later in life, there were certainly a lot of health issues, and just the general environment that he was living in. He was in Paris during the Nazi occupation with a limited number of students. But what's remarkable about him is he kept teaching, and I just find him remarkable because of all the things he went through throughout his life. You know, the Russian Revolution, the World War I, World War II, and he never lost his aim. His aim was always to teach, and he continued with that. He varied his methods along the way, but he stuck to it. And I can't remember your first question. I'm sorry. There was one about the enneagram. The personality typing that the enneagram is based on, I don't think came from Gurdjieff. It came later on. I want to say Ichaso. I can't remember the man's first name. The enneagram would take a whole other presentation, and I think it can be used for many things, perhaps personality as well, but the personality types that you see in some of the books, like by Helen Palmer, but that came later. I hope that answers your questions.
Thank you. That was, by the way, a great presentation. I'll enjoy watching it over and over again as I try and then absorb everything you had. Appreciate it.
Thanks, JD. I appreciate that.
And thank you. And Sue has hand raised. I think you were next.
Oh, sorry, I was just putting the clapping.
Oh, maybe you're just waving. Yeah.
Right, yes, good presentation. In fact, I'd love to hear it again. So I'm hoping that'll be available to us.
Thank you, Sue.
Deborah Smith.
Oh, great presentation, Jeff. Thank you. I know nothing about Gurdjieff. The movements, do they have like a spiritual component, or is it more for this awareness? Could you just give some comments to the movements? I think they're quite beautiful. I've watched them before, and just in a little aside, I saw this show quite some time ago. I forget the name of it, but movements were part of this thing where this group of students or something came together, and in the end, they sort of came together where these movements, touch some higher aspect to help them deal with a school shooting or something. But anyway, just some comments if you could on that. Thank you. Over.
Yeah, that's interesting what you just said there. Yes, they definitely have a spiritual element. Two things that come to my mind, Deborah, are one is there's an attempt to align the mind, the heart, and the body. And through that alignment, that's, as Madame de Saltzman said, where you can begin to connect to a higher energy. So that's one of the things. The other thing that comes to my mind is that Gurdijeff said these sacred dances that occurred thousands of years ago often were coded. They were providing esoteric information, symbolic of different things, and that if you had a certain level of understanding, you could read them like a book, and you would learn a great deal from them. So those are the two things that come to my mind.
Fascinating. It reminds me of Hawaiian dance, for example, tells a whole story through the movements passed down.
Yeah.
Gwen.
Well, you brought me to tears. I'm sure Cy would love this.
Oh, thank you.
Beautiful.
I loved Cy.
Cy, Jeff, and I did a program for the TS on Gurdieff's work. And I think they have it in the archives if anybody's interested. But I was going to also say, Jeff, you picked up the high points in everything he did. And beyond each thing that you presented, you could write a book on each thing.
Absolutely.
And he addressed it in practice when you lived in community with him. There are communities, Gurdjieff communities right now, probably hundreds of them all over the world. And they are thriving. You have to literally learn how to impartially judge, to observe yourself. And what I've noticed as a psychologist, I integrate a lot of Gurdjieff's work into my psychotherapy because what I notice is that people have to learn to impartially observe themselves. And it takes years. It takes a lot of effort. And you hit some very high points. I would love to see you do another presentation on the law of the world maintenance and law of octaves and that type of thing. Because everything that Gurdjieff did was headed toward vibrations, higher vibrations, to get your body into receiving higher vibrations, which is the spiritual work of all of us. Anyway, enough said. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Thank you, Gwen. And I agree with you. Something as simple as observing yourself detachedly, is, at least for me, is a very difficult thing. So it's not as easy as it sounds. Thank you.
Thanks, Gwen. Suzanne.
Well, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation and the summary. I just wanted to mention that in the chat, Seth pointed out that the movie is called OA, that Deborah mentioned. My question is, so it's hard work that Gurdjieff demands of us. Did you do it mostly on your own, or did you do it in group work? Do you feel it's best? Because you have to try to be objective. And if you talk about your weaknesses or whatever, I could talk to my husband or my son or good friends. How would you approach that? And I have the Ginsberg book, and I think this is a very good start, actually, if anybody is new to Gurdjieff, to approach this on your own until you find a group. What are your thoughts on that?
Suzanne, I think it's a great point you're making. And traditionally, the most effective way of practicing these teachings is considered to be with a group. And, in Gurdjieff's day, he was considered a master or a teacher. he would intentionally put people together to create friction because he wanted those students to see what their triggers were, what the processes that were going on in their personality. So yes, working with other people is probably the most effective way of working with these teachings. It's just hard to find groups of people to work with nowadays, and so you do your best, on your own or with whoever you can hook up with.
Well, and also working in groups, you have to be honest. That means you have to trust the group members, to keep, not to share it, because it's the honesty at looking at yourself and pointing it out and sharing it with others.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think there's some good books about life at the pre-array that kind of shows the things you're talking about. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah,
One thing I wanted to mention real fast, because I kind of went over it quickly. Gurdjieff's a little different from other traditions in the sense that he says we have to build a soul. And so like those bodies, those higher being bodies, the astral, the mental, the causal, he says they're either not existing when we're born or they're not fully developed. And our spiritual work is to develop the astral, to develop the mental and the causal. And the causal ultimately is what he calls the soul. So we're kind of born with the soul in embryo, which is essence. And I don't know if I made that point clear, but it was striking to me when I first came across the idea because it's very different from what I had read in other traditions.
It's about making it more conscious, that being aware of being aware. And oftentimes we put it in our mental pocket that we have this soul, but we don't spend the disciplines and the time building it and taking care of the vibrations that build it, because we get caught up in the lingo. And Gurdjieff was really, JD, you were talking about the truth of the meetings was remarkable. Gurdjieff taught in allegory. He taught very much in allegory and metaphor. So that's what Jeff brings it to reality in what he's saying. But that's why his own writings are so difficult to understand.
Thanks, Glenn. Desiree, I didn't mean to preempt any further questions, but
Oh, no, you're fine. That's fine. Yeah, it's sometimes with these presentations, it's a shame that the hour, comes to an end. Anyway, I just want to say thank you again and just say that Connie Jones repeated Gwen's words that another presentation would be excellent. So we welcome you back anytime you'd like to expand on any of these points. Really a great presentation. And so we are past the hour now and no one has their hand up. So I'll go ahead and close it up and say thank you again. And thank you everybody for being here. Have a fantastic week. See you next time. And Suzanne, you probably know off the top of your head what next week's presentation is. You're muted still.
Oh, okay. Well,
Doss McDavid.
Ask me
yeah,
anything.
Doss McDavid, and I'm going to send this out, the information about the recording. But Doss McDavid used to be the National Secretary of Education before before David Bruce. He's very knowledgeable. Gwen, do you want to say something about him? Because he is from your lodge and you know him very well. And he wrote also books. And did you want to add something?
Well, he is in the intellectual realm of the Secret Doctrine and all of Blavatsky's work in the same category as David Regal, Pablo, Smalley, all of them. He has tremendous knowledge. And I have such a close relationship with him that I'm always joking with him, but he's got a great sense of humor. Great. It's like Michael Gomes, very similar to Michael Gomes. So I would say if you have questions at all about Blavatsky's secret doctrine, anything around the TS, any theosophical studies, he is probably one of the best professionals in this area. So strongly advise it.
So save your questions and bring them next week. And look forward to seeing you then. And thank you again, Jeff. I'm going to go ahead
Thank
and
you, guys.
thank you. Good afternoon. Good morning, whatever time it is. Yes. Bye.